Hello, humans. Today we are going to be talking about the Reconstruction Amendments. So, this is our first set of amendments beyond the Bill of Rights. And there is a group of amendments that we consider the Reconstruction Amendments that happen after Reconstruction in the Civil War. So, our goals for this notes video are to explain the historical context of these Reconstruction Amendments, which, as we will see, are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then to explain how the Reconstruction Amendments attempted to address African American inequality and the continued struggles that African Americans faced despite their passage. Right, these amendments weren't perfect. So those are our goals for today. So let's get started. Context. Let's talk about context. It is important to study context to understand the why behind anything. So when we're talking about the context of these amendments, I am going to be asking you guys, and you are expected to know why we have the amendments we have. So that's why we always talk about this and why we always start there. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments make up what are called the Reconstruction Amendments. Okay? And these occur after the Civil War, which was from 1861 to 1865. And not getting too into it, this was basically fought over issues of national power versus states' rights, and also slavery and taxes. Now, states at this time were not forced to recognize the Bill of Rights. So, this is part of the reason why slavery was still in existence, and this is part of the reason why we were fighting over it. Now, as you guys know, the North, the Union, wins the war. And as a result, they have the opportunity to change things. And this brings about amendments to the Constitution. And when I say change things, right, we know that slavery was abolished, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, things like that. So we are going to see amendments to the Constitution to address these new changes. Now, the Reconstruction era is the context of all of these amendments. And if something is being reconstructed, it means it's being rebuilt or put back together. So the Reconstruction era was this time period after the Civil War where the South was adjusting to new rules and changes, most notably incorporating newly freed slaves into society as citizens. Right? Remember, before then, they were slaves, they were property. So now there are amendments that are going to incorporate or, bring them into society and, let them be citizens. Okay. So how do these amendments then attempt to address the inequality that African Americans faced, especially once they were newly freed from slavery? The 13th Amendment says this: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, subject to their jurisdiction means like any colonies or territories that we might have. So, what this does is it formally abolishes slavery in the United States. It outlaws slavery, being personal property of another human being, and involuntary servitude. So, forced labor, you can't be forced to do any of that. That is considered slavery and it is illegal. Now, the reality of the 13th Amendment, right? It might sound great. Okay, we don't have slavery, the end. As you guys know, or maybe you don't, but there is still slavery around the world. There is still slavery in the United States. It's just not what you think of now. Back then, right, slavery was just banned. And the reality of this 13th Amendment is, yes, it is abolished, but the slaves were turned free with nothing, and literally nothing. No property, just what was on their backs. They had no education largely. Many of them, if not most of them, could not read or write. And if they could, it wasn't very well. So the job opportunities that were available for newly freed slaves was very slim. As a result, many former slaves returned to plantation labor as sharecroppers because that type of work was all they knew. So what we see is a continual cycle then of slaves not only being uneducated, but also kept in jobs that don't pay very well, if at all. Okay, so the reality of the 13th Amendment was that inequalities definitely still existed. Now, the 14th Amendment was passed also during this time, and this is probably the most important amendment to the Constitution. It's very long, so I apologize. But the text of this says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, meaning they become a citizen, are citizens of the United States. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge or take away the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So that's a lot to unpack. So what I did, so let's talk about 3 things that it does. The first thing that the 14th Amendment does is, first and foremost, establishes citizenship, right? So 13th Amendment, we abolish slavery. Slavery is no longer a thing. Now that people are no longer slaves, right, you have to be a citizen, right? So they have to be a citizen of the country, and that's what the 14th Amendment does. The 14th Amendment also incorporates the Bill of Rights to the states. Prior to this, the states did not have to follow technically the Bill of Rights, so those first 10 amendments. So this is increasing the equality in the country. And the 14th Amendment also provides equal protection under the law. So again, the intent here was, regardless of your race or previous condition of servitude, you were to be treated equally and to be treated fairly according to the law. Now, the reality of the 14th Amendment, right, is very similar to the reality of the 13th Amendment. It attempted to address inequality, but there were issues that popped up that kind of took a step back and actually caused a little bit more issues for African Americans and minorities. So what we see happen is, yes, African Americans are citizens and they are supposed to be treated with equality, and everybody is supposed to be treated equally and fairly. What we see happen is the South especially establishes what we call black codes and Jim Crow laws. And without getting into too much detail about those, really what those were for was to control and oppress, discriminate against African Americans, and to establish segregation between the races, so separation. So this is where we see, waiting rooms for people who are of color versus people who are white. Okay, and that was the reality of this. A lot of states were able to kind of navigate around the 14th Amendment through these codes and Jim Crow laws. Okay, so the 15th Amendment says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So think of it like this. 13th Amendment, no longer slaves. Once they're no longer slaves, we need the 14th Amendment to establish citizenship. The number one privilege of being a citizen is being able to vote. So that's why we have the 15th Amendment. So what this does is that it allowed African American men to vote. That's important. Not everybody can vote. African American men. Okay? And this amendment says that even if you used to be a slave, you still have the right to vote if you are a male. Now, as you've learned in history, again, there is a reality to this. It wasn't necessarily the case. There were still struggles that African Americans faced, including literacy tests. So in order to vote in especially some of those southern states, you had to take a literacy test, which if you've never seen one, they were questions like this that you see down here, right? Very complicated, unnecessarily questions to try and ban or bar or prevent African Americans from voting. Poll taxes. Poll taxes were a fee that you had to pay in order to vote, right? We talked about, as a consequence with the 13th Amendment, slaves didn't know how to read or write. Many of them returned to plantation labor, so they weren't making a lot of money, and they therefore couldn't pay the poll taxes. And then you had grandfather clauses, and those were basically saying if your grandfather was able to vote in a previous election, you can vote. However, many freed African Americans, their grandfathers were slaves, and that then prevented them from being able to vote as well. Now, over time, civil rights have expanded. However, people of color continue to be disenfranchised or prevented from participating in politics and discriminated against despite these amendments. And the various branches of our government have had to get involved since the Reconstruction amendments to extend civil rights to minorities. So I want to first start with the executive branch. Just a couple of examples over our history. Presidents can issue what we call executive orders, and there was an executive order that banned racial discrimination in the workplace. That was definitely a thing, especially around like the time of segregation. So we had to have the executive order to ban that from happening. President Eisenhower had to step in and federalize the National Guard to enforce the desegregation of schools because citizens and public schools were almost refusing to honor that order, that desegregation. The legislative branch also has taken steps to extend civil rights to freed African Americans. So the 24th Amendment was passed in 1964, and that outlawed or banned that poll tax, that fee to be able to vote. We've had various civil rights and voting acts in the 1960s, prohibiting discrimination in public accommodations, employment, outlawing segregation. The Voting Rights Act was created to enforce the 15th Amendment and required the federal government to supervise voting in elections because they found the states were the ones that were kind of navigating and violating those amendments. And then big time for the judicial branch, one action taken was the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. And that was overturning that separate but equal and outlawing segregation. So Plessy versus Ferguson is the case that creates segregation, and Brown versus Board of Education is what overturns and outlaws segregation. Okay? So remember, our learning objectives were to explain the historical context of the Reconstruction amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and then explain how these amendments attempted to address inequality among African Americans and the continued struggles that African Americans faced despite their passage. So go ahead and answer the questions at the end, record your score, and then record your correct answers on your note sheet, and let me know if you guys have any questions. I'll talk to you later. See ya.